Welcome, everyone, to Asian Pacific Voices Radio, where you'll find stimulating conversations that explore diverse topics and stories impacting our Asian Pacific American communities. I'm your host, Arnold Chun. My guest joining me today is an Emmy Award-winning transgender Foley artist renowned for her mastery in creating performative and custom sound effects for film, documentary, TV, games, and virtual reality. With an impressive portfolio including AAA titles like God of War Ragnarok and Marvel's Spider-Man 2, she currently co-leads the internal Foley department at Sony PlayStation Creative Arts Sound Studios. Her contributions extend beyond the gaming realm, with notable film credits such as Manchester by the Sea and The Invisible Man. A trailblazer in her field, her work underscores her commitment to excellence and innovation, making her a prominent voice in the entertainment industry. It is my pleasure to welcome Joanna Fang on Asian Pacific Voices Radio. Welcome.
Hi, how's it going, Arnold?
Fantastic. So glad to have you here. And I'm a big fan of your work, so just want to say the first.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, that was quite quite an awesome intro. I really appreciate the the appreciation for the things that I've had a chance to work on. But yeah, I'm just so exhilarated to be chatting with you today.
Well, we like to roll out the red carpet, you know what I mean? I mean, you've clearly done some amazing work, like I mentioned, and so just want to jump right into it. I know you're currently co-leading the internal Foley department at Sony PlayStation Creative Arts Sound Studios. Can you talk to us a little bit about what inspired you to pursue a career in Foley artistry?
Yeah, so I was really lucky. When I was a kid, my mom insisted I take piano lessons at like Yamaha Music School, and so in our lives as a family, we were always so deeply invested in music. I was very lucky to have had time and the resources to train as a musician. And when I was growing up, I loved singing. I loved music. And so what happened was while coming through college, I kind of got burnt out on music actually. And so when I pivoted over to start studying film, I dropped out of NYU's music department and I joined the film school. And I originally intended to go to film school to learn to be a cinematographer. But very quickly, some of my friends found out that I had sight reading skills from all those years studying classical voice music. And a friend of mine was like, "You should try Foley. It's filmmaking, but it's sound performance using props and shoes and clothing to create kind of the score for what human beings and characters are doing on screen. And you have to be really good at seeing the screen and performing in sync with the characters. So I kind of got dragged into it at first, and very quickly I realized like this is it. This combined everything I loved about music, everything I loved about filmmaking. It was kinetic, it was performative, and I really had to learn to like walk in other people's shoes to do the job. And so it went from being kind of like a funny thing I was good at to a real career because I just fell in love with Foley. And so, graduating at NYU Film School, I started apprenticing for this amazing Foley artist. His name's Les Bloom, and he works out of New York. And he took me under his wing, and I was so lucky to train with him and grow as a Foley artist for 7 years out there. And along the way, I like won an Emmy, and uh, it just became a thing where we were on the forefront of the New York independent film scene. And during that time, especially pre-COVID, during the tax incentive, it just did not stop coming. We were just constantly following projects. So fast forward after all those years with Alchemy, that was the name of the studio. Uh, PlayStation said they needed to. PlayStation wanted to create their own internal Foley department and have our team work for them. So I actually got out of the film industry and transitioned to video games, and so that's why we are where we are right now. Actually,
Yeah, I know. I can see you've got some amazing equipment back there. Kind of went over there, come over there and push some buttons and see what happens, or maybe not,
yeah,
right?
yeah. No, it's a for those of you who are listening via audio only. I have this beautiful recording studio that's loaded with all sorts of shoes and clothing and weird props, anything to make a cool sound.
So I imagine doing video games versus film, there's got to be a bit of a difference. I mean, collaborating with game developers versus a director or, sound design department team. Can you share a little bit about like the differences of that?
Yeah, yeah, no, of course. So obviously, films are these beautiful linear experiences, right? And they have a distinct beginning, middle, and end. And when you watch a film, it's going to be the same every time. It's not like the sounds are going to change every time you press play. Whereas in a video game, we have the cinematics, which are basically small films, and they can last anywhere from 3 to 6 hours on some of these projects cumulatively. And so it's like Foleying 3 feature films. And additionally, beyond that, you have all the gameplay in which the sounds, these footsteps, these clothing sounds, they have to stand up to repeated use. They have to sound good repetitively and sound great inside a virtual environment where we're simulating the sound of reverb. We're simulating the randomization of footsteps. So on one hand, it's like folding the longest film you've ever. It's like working on the longest film you've ever seen. And on the other hand, we have to play with this like Rubik's cube of like, how do I record 7 different shoes across 22 different floors, and they want 7 different ways that people can walk or gates that people have. So it very rapidly scales up. And so you're in these worlds for like years at a time.
Wow. I mean, you've worked on obviously Manchester by the Sea, Promising Young Woman. Um, Talk about some of the challenges that you faced, like having to work on projects like that, as opposed to some of the challenges that you see in like the video game world.
Yeah, so I will say the film world is so interesting because, you know, we're trying to capture this sincere element of something, right? And so on movies like Manchester by the Sea or Promising Young Woman, these are very at times emotionally charged films, right? And so I was very lucky that on Manchester by the Sea, uh we had entire sequences where dialogues dimmed down and it's only using Foley or only using sound effects to drive the plot. In those situations, it was about nailing the perfect pistol rip out of cop belt, right? That's like a big moment in that film where Casey Affleck's character realizes that he's responsible for destroying his entire life. And so he's in a police precinct and he just decides at the spur of the moment that he doesn't want to live anymore, and so he reaches for the gun. And so in a film like that, that moment's really packed. It's very full of emotional loading, and it made sense to us that it took us quite a few tries to get that sound of the pistol coming out correct. And so on films, I feel like you're looking for that perfect one sound, right? And you have to be very much literate to what's happening in the story. So we were able to do like scenes, like scene study. Like as they say in acting school, like you're able to sit down with the scene, look at beginning, middle, end, and come to a conclusion. Whereas on a film, when working on something like Marvel Spider-Man 2, we're looking to make sure that several things work. First of all, that the story is told. It's still storytelling, and that still needs that same emotional pack punch, right? Like we still have to recognize, oh, this character's going from A to B to C, and all these terrible things are happening. On the other hand, as I said, in terms of repetition and scope, I might, pull off a goopy symbiote from a character in one cutscene, and then 5 minutes later, we have an entire gameplay section where you have to do that 20, 30 times. So I have to somehow perfect the art of it sounding correct in the cinematic. So it's dramatic, while at the same time finding ways to perform it multiple times. And you're searching for not just that one perfect sound, you're searching for a series of sounds that move people and that drive them to do this thing. So we're compelling the audience to take a role in our storytelling. Whereas in films, we are trying to present this definitive moment.
That's a great point. Do you find the time commitments to do the Foley on a game versus a film are longer, shorter? The difference of that? I mean,
Way, way longer for sure. Like even in even some of the more how do I put this? I think in films, especially nowadays where we've democratized filmmaking and there are plenty of people who need sound effects for their projects, our feature film budgets, even at the highest level, keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and people expect more and more and more. Whereas
mm.
the video game industry, these entertainment products are so complicated and so complex that easily that time increases. Yeah, at the same time, everyone wants to make their projects have a smaller footprint economically. Like everyone wants to be a little bit more sustainable, a little bit more profitable. However, I've just noticed that with a video game, because so many things can change at the drop of a hat. You know, in a film, if you said, we want this scene to take place in a house instead of at the grocery store, okay, it's like, oh, we have to reshoot it. We have, that
Yeah.
happens way before Foley gets there. But in a video game, if they're thinking like a scene doesn't quite work on the streets of New York, then they might completely at the very last minute just pick up those characters and place the scene somewhere else. And so
Wow.
for them, it's as easy as like a few button presses and it goes through the pipeline. But for filmmaking, when we make changes, they can be drastic sometimes. And so I think that's kind of a big reason why video games take so much longer to work on.
Very, very true. Yeah, especially if like uh, a location has an issue that's outside of the control of production. I mean, what are you going to do? You got to, shift directions and stuff like that.
Right.
Um, in terms of techniques, would love to hear like what are some of the, tricks of the trade, if you want to call it that, that you use to ensure sound effects that you create enhance the overall narrative of a film or a game. Like, show us the little, treasure box that you got.
Yeah, no, it's so funny. So we're in this room surrounded by great props, and there's a bunch, but I will tell people that you don't need the exact correct thing to make the right sound. Like you don't need to be forensically or scientifically accurate to what you see on screen, right? Like reality is kind of boring sounding. And so in our room, there's a bunch of stuff that we look at and we're just like, wait, that's supposed to be that sound. So if you don't mind, you can give me 1 second. I'll grab something and show y'all what it is. But one moment.
Yes, please.
Okay, check, check. One, two. All right. So this is one of my favorite little bins. Uh, for those of you who are listening to the podcast, I have this giant plastic box, and if you pop it open, it smells terrible. But inside we have basically the goop that we used to play as kids. It's made out of
Oh, wow.
polyvinyl alcohol, I believe. And inside we have this thing that's called a chamois, and they use this to like dry off cars and stuff. And so what we realized that if you suspend this inside this goop, you get this like really gross sound,
Oh,
but it's fun because for a lot of our projects we have these, well, especially on Marvel Spider-Man 2, we have these symbiotes, Venom and all these crazy alien characters who are the creative director told us it was wet but not wet. It was goopy but not wet. And so we're trying to figure out like how do you convey almost like a fluid like sound without using water. And so we just went back to when we were kids, and me and my coworker Blake Collins, he's a Foley engineer, also very acclaimed. We just started playing with different textures, and we're like, okay, how do we make water thick? How do we create the stuff so that it like merges together and gets like dense? And so this was one really awesome setup that we have that worked really well. And we even utilized kind of the box itself, because if I were to put this goop in a different orifice, it changes the sound like an acoustic guitar, right? So this was a really fun thing, and we've set this up multiple times, and every now and then it gets a little too gross, so we have to throw it away. But when it sings, it sings. It's like playing a violin, it's like Stradivarius.
that's so cool. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing that. That's amazing.
Of course, of course.
On to the next topic here. So I know you've been featured as a public speaker at various conferences and conventions, including the Game Developers Conference and the AES NAB. What kind of topics do you love to cover in those presentations? Like, what do you like to give your audiences something to take away from when you speak there?
Yeah, no, I must say that first and foremost, my opinions are my own, do not reflect Sony PlayStation or Sony Interactive Entertainment. That being said, though, I do get to go out quite a bit and kind of evangelize Foley sound effects, not just to represent myself, but to actually, in a lot of ways, um, kind of show the world that you know we still custom create sound effects for a lot of things. I think folks nowadays are so used to the idea that everything's a library or everything comes from like machine learning or something like that. When the truth is, there's still tons of recording that has to happen on a game. And so when I go out and do these uh, public speaking gigs, a lot of times we're trying to get under the hood and show them that, like, hey, here's the stuff. Like, there's certain types of gigs where I just explain what Foley is on the baseline level, right? It's performative sound effects. It's the fact that when we were all little kids, we could remember distinctly the sound of our parents' footsteps as they walked towards our childhood bedroom door. And you could usually tell which parent it was and the emotional content that they're about to deliver, right? Like, I remember every Sunday morning, my dad rushing to try to wake up all of us to go to temple, and so I remember the sound of my mom shuffling quite aggressively down the hallway because we received a large envelope from UCSD, but a medium-sized envelope from NYU. Don't know what that's about. Like, we remember these charged moments, and so I would say that, like, roughly half the time, I'm trying to encourage folks to think that sounds are inherently tied with emotions, and they're part of our storytelling language. How we talk, the musical instruments we play, these are all reflective of how we're feeling. So that's kind of half the equation. The other half of the equation, when it comes to discussing Foley, especially at places like GDC or AES, these like larger trade organizations or video game conferences, we're trying to show people that, okay, here's the heart, now here's the brain, right? Like, here's all the passion and the emotional loading that we can put into certain sounds, and here's how we deploy them, and here's where things get complicated, right? And so, for instance, uh, on Marvel Spider-Man 2, we had to create the sound of Marvel's New York City, which is massive. And how do you create walking sound effects for a city that is roughly can have up to 7 million people in it, right? And in the video game world, we'll randomly generate thousands of different variations of civilians. Like, how do you capture that? How do you perform that? And how do we create a compelling space? And so, um, like, for example, at GDC, we discussed how do you create civilian footsteps for such a large populace, and what we figured out was there were like 7 types of shoes that any character can wear in that environment, like 7 archetypal shoes, like boots, sneakers, flip-flops, flats, and there were 22 different surfaces they can walk on, and there were, I think, what was 11 different ways that they can walk. So then how do you organize, like, these files? There's like 40,000 footstep sounds. Like, how do you organize that? How do you make that compelling? How do you make it so that it doesn't sound like just pitter patter and actually could be used purposefully? And so, kind of, that's what obsesses me about Foley. It's not just the emotional side, but it's also the intellectual side of it.
When you were sharing about the footsteps, oh my gosh, I totally got reminded of like when my dad found out I got kicked out of the choir and the running of the footsteps to the room because I knew I was in trouble. Oh man, I remember it gave me chills. It was like seriously death, certain imminent death that was about to happen.
Yeah,
Oh my
yeah.
gosh.
No, we remember these things. We give them textures. Like, I remember the
Yeah.
sound of like water splashing in the bathtub in my mom's room. Like, I just remember that sound because it was like such a warm, comfortable sound. But yeah, sounds are loaded with emotions, and I think that's the cool thing about filmmaking and storytelling is that we're trying to relate to people and use that shared language, right? And so, um video games on the other hand are such a technologically massive thing that's just made up of blood, sweat, and pixels, right? And so we're trying to be just as emotive and just as expressive as a great film or a great novel, and we're using every tool in our arsenal to
Mm,
create that.
yeah. Now, speaking of tools and technology, what do you see out there that is either enhancing or kind of, unfortunately, I mean, there's so much talk about just the way AI is changing all of the support staff that, go into the filmmaking process and how their jobs might be limited. Do you kind of see maybe that happening, possibly in the Foley world?
I think to a degree, and these are my own opinions, obviously. I have to mention that, but I will say that, like, anytime there's been a new technological tool, we as artists have adapted to it. We've looked at these things and asked ourselves, do we still have what are the levers we still have to make something interesting? And so I always found it fascinating because when people think about Foley, specifically like footsteps, in the big picture scheme of sound design, it's easy to see them as being unnecessary, right? If your film's plot doesn't hinge on these perfectly performed footsteps, or if you're doing a music video in which there's no Foley at all, um then it could be argued that if you do need the sound of a footstep, you can easily bring something in. You don't need to hire like an Emmy Award winning massive Foley team to cover that. However, that is to be said that on the other hand, you have projects that Foley is an inherent part of the storytelling, or it's part of immersion. Like we need it to sound a certain way in order to immerse people both virtually inside the theater or on a video game or in a video game world, or emotionally immerse people. Like when I create these sounds, a lot of them don't actually exist in the real world. We're trying to place you, the listener, in the auditory, haptic feeling of being a character in the story. So when it comes to machine learning, when it comes to I think that these are yet again more and more affordable tools that will hopefully help democratize folks' ability to tell stories. On the other hand, I do think about the fact that, when I was coming up through film school, feature film budgets kept shrinking. By the time I started training at Alchemy Post Sound, we were getting 3 days to do independent films. And then you look at this task in front of me and go, how are we going to shoot and record all the footsteps for this 2-hour film in 3 days?
Mm,
So it's kind of a cautionary tale. I always remind people we want to be able to use digital technologies and any sort of innovation technology to make things easier, to make our ability to express things more fluid and to be heard and recognized in that way. On the other
mm,
hand, there is a toll because I think people start a lot of folks who maybe aren't like specialists, they start thinking they can cut certain corners, and they go ahead and do that before even consulting with actors, actresses, Foley artists, or cinematographers. And what ends up happening is by the time we actually get a chance to work on it, there's been so many compromises that we don't have time, or we don't have space, or we don't have the resources to properly do it. So I think the technology will always continue to get better and better, but we as people need to remember a few things. One, there will always be somebody smashing coconuts together to make sounds. Like our ability to tell stories, our ability to convey language and develop instruments or music or even make music, it's all tied to the fact that human beings want to perform, you know?
mm.
And uh, so you have that on one hand. I think it's inherent that no matter how faster or better or more interesting the technology gets, um, that despite that, we still have a foundational desire to make stuff. And so
Mm.
if we can focus on that as the thing that connects all of us instead of always thinking about commerce or always thinking about, the fastest, if we separate the concept that things are fast, therefore they're better, um, then we can learn to coexist with these type of innovations that can very much jeopardize the way we make projects and the way we convey emotion.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a very interesting point, and I know you mentioned budgets several times. So I was thinking, are the expectations still not then adjusting to the shrinking budgets? And how do you convey that? How do you clearly communicate that with your team and your clients of like letting them know, like, look, if you shrink the budget, I can't give you this? Or do they just expect you to deliver it no matter what?
I think it's kind of tough because back when I worked in independent film, it became a negotiation of compromises, right, and setting expectations. So, for instance, if we know we don't have a lot of time on a film, then we're gonna go after the most important sounds or the things that Foley's really good at, right? I can come up with the sound of a helicopter crashing. That's not that's something we can do. But is it easier for a sound designer to cut those sounds in, and then I can focus on the person crawling out of the wreckage? Like that's where Foley's really good. We're good at finding these performative emotional sounds that don't have a consistent analog or can't be found on the internet or in the library, right? And so when it comes time to look at something that is maybe a little leaner, I always tell people, okay, we have to focus on things that we're good at, you know? It's going to take forever to
Mm,
edit in footsteps from a sound effects library. It's much faster for us to perform the feat. On the other hand, if you don't need to hear footsteps during that big music montage, then great, let us know. Then we don't have to like waste 30 minutes recording footsteps for something that's never going to be heard, right?
mm,
And so that's kind of the way we've worked in the independent film industry, especially when it comes to limited budgets. Where things
mm,
get tough is you get people who come around and say, "Oh, I want a full music and effects track for foreign distribution." And it's like, okay, so we only had 3 days on the film, so we might not be able to do that, but we'll cover all of the most artistically relevant moments. So that way when hopefully if something receives foreign distribution, okay, we could solve that problem when we get to it. But in the meantime, if someone's trying to get a film to Sundance or Cannes, the the storytelling and the ability to show an audience, hey, you want to care about this film, you want to see this film succeed, that comes down to certain splashes where we can't compromise, we have to create a sound there, right? And
Mm,
so that's
yeah.
kind of the way I look at it.
Mhm. That's a great perspective, and I really resonate with that. I think we're always faced with like, yeah, they want more for less all the time, and so
Always.
sometimes you got to tell them like, look, I can't do more for less. It's not possible. Um, on the note of being an Asian American and the representation that we see in mainstream media, what kind of advice would you give to those that are coming up that would want to do what you're doing? Where do people start? What do you tell them?
Yeah, no, it's funny. I always tell people, what I've always wanted to find the Yo-Yo Ma of Foley. Like I wanna meet somebody in their 20s who's been studying Foley since they were 3. But I know it's not gonna happen, right? Like this is such a specific art form. I always tell people though that if you want a job in any form of the arts, remember that like every class you've ever taken, every lesson you've ever learned, every experience you've ever had is just incredible source and experience that you can then put into whatever it is you end up doing. Like when I first moved to New York to study music, I thought I was going to be like the next Jeff Buckley, right? I wanted to be like the next great musical artist. However, I when I got burnt out on music, I was left with all these incredible skills, but know where to use them. And so I was really lucky when Foley as an art form extracted my performing skills and my sound skills, my sight reading skills. And it didn't just do that, but Foley as an art form, as a Foley artist, I pull from my life experience constantly, especially as someone who's trans. Like um, I think about all the ways that people perform their gender identity, like masculine footsteps or feminine footsteps, or all the life experience of knowing what it's like to put on makeup or wear a dress versus, some other Foley artists who maybe have never experienced that for themselves. And I just let people know that there's no such thing as a bad investment when it comes to finding your statement as an artist, right? And so
Mm,
everything from taking a course on forensic anthropology, like I, for instance, took a course on how do crime scene investigators look at bones and figure out how somebody died. Like that doesn't make any sort of sense in the context of what I do as a Foley artist. However,
mm,
as like a human being who's invested in the arts and in other people, it taught me about other people's skills and tradecraft, and also it taught me what the sound of bones act like. They taught me what bones actually sound like and what they
mm,
feel like. And so I could take that and apply it back into my art.
mm. That's amazing. That's really, really awesome. Okay, last two things. Funny anecdote, unexpected things that's happened during your time in the world of Foley artistry. And number two, if you had to create the Foley sound effects for a classic film in the past, which one would you do and why?
Um, those are amazing questions. Sorry, I had to clear my throat. Um,
It's okay.
I always find there's always magic in the chaotic, and goodness gracious, what was it? There was a sound I came up with recently that was purely by accident, and we just kept it. Um, what was it? What was it? Oh yeah, we were doing the sound of snow, and we just finished working on a project that had a bunch of charcoal on the floor, and we had used it as the sound of walking on ash, right? Like something that's been burned down. But I was stepping on it, and we had like a blanket on top of it because it gets really dusty and gross. I stepped on it, I was like, oh my gosh, that sounds like snow, like the crunch of snow. And so it was so weird because I have this thing that's produced from fire to create the sound of something that's produced from water or ice, right? And so for me, that was like a strange revelation. And since then, we've used like lump charcoal for tons of snow sound effects. So that's one like happy accident. Um, in terms of films, if I could refoley an entire film, I would actually probably say Hard Boiled. Like
Oh, good
the
choice.
yeah, there's that incredible sequence. It's like classic Hong Kong action film. There's this amazing sequence where it's almost a oneer, and they're just running through this hospital hallway, going up and down elevators, and they're trying to fight their way to rescue people. And it's like such an intense moment, and it's all just some of the best action choreography you've ever seen. And Chow Yun Fat and everybody's just crossing camera and stuff like that, and like reloading, like in the elevator, sweating, reloading their weapons. They're not sure what's going to happen next. So for me, that film was really impactful as a kid, and if I had to Foley one film again, it'd probably be that one.
That's an awesome film. I remember seeing it with John Woo. I mean, John Woo killed that thing.
Oh yeah,
That thing was
incredible.
awesome.
Incredible. Yeah, I remember watching like Mission Impossible 2 and then being like, okay, I want to see the
Yeah.
rest of this guy's filmography, and yeah,
Right,
so
exactly. Oh man. Joanna, thank you so much for your time. My goodness, it was just such a pleasure for you joining me today on today's show. And we can't thank you enough just for just the amazing anecdotes, wisdom and knowledge and just experiences. I think our listeners are going to love listening to you if they want to go into Foley and learn more about that world. It's going to be awesome.
oh yeah, of
So,
course.
Joanna, just thank you so much just for all the input, the wisdom, the experiences, the anecdotes. My gosh, you're just like a complete library of just amazing information. Where can people follow you? How can they get to know more of your work? Please give us all of your social media handles, everything that people we need to know to follow you.
Yeah, you could find me on Instagram as the_Foley_artist. Yeah, I'm very lucky to have that Foley handle or to have that username, but you can find me on there. You can also find me on LinkedIn.com. I actually take a lot of questions from college students and people wanting to break into the industry, specifically on LinkedIn. So yeah, you could folks can find me there, and if they want to hear some cool sound effects, they can find me on Instagram.
Awesome. Once again, I want to thank my guest, Joanna Fang, for joining me on today's show. We would love to also hear from you, our valued listeners, about any suggestions for future guests and topics. Don't forget to subscribe to our program on your favorite podcast platform and follow us on Facebook, X, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. Asian Pacific Voices Radio is produced by Asian Culture and Media Alliance, a nonprofit that empowers the Asian Pacific American communities with a voice through media arts. If you'd like to support our program, please visit AsianPacificVoicesRadio.com. I'm Arnold Chun. Please join us next week for another exciting and thought-provoking Asian Pacific Voices Radio show. Until then, take care, everybody.
Have a good one.